Lady Matilda, I was just...
You cannot have him, Laura will.
The lanterns of Iron Vale Estate burned gold that evening, the kind of gold that belongs only to celebrations. Warm, generous, proud, music drifted up from the grand ballroom below, weaving between laughter and crystal glasses, filling the stone corridors with joy that felt almost too perfect to be real. And it was. Kate stood on the tower balcony, her ivory engagement gown catching the last breath of the evening wind. She was 22 years old, with long dark hair that fell across her shoulders like river water in October, and eyes that held the kind of quiet sincerity that most people spend a lifetime pretending to have. She was not looking at the crowd below. She was looking at the stars, the way she always did when she wanted to hold a moment still, to press it between her palms before it slipped away. She had no reason to be afraid. The man she loved was downstairs. The guests were celebrating. And the woman now stepping silently through the balcony doorway behind her was the woman who had raised her, clothed her, sat at the same breakfast table as her for 11 years. Lady Matilda closed the balcony door without a sound. She was dressed in deep plum velvet, her dark hair pinned in a severe aristocratic arrangement, pearls resting at her collar like a crown she had decided to wear at the throat instead of the head. Her expression was composed, the kind of composed that takes years of practice to perfect. She looked, to any distant observer, like a woman about to offer her stepdaughter a loving word on her engagement night. She was not. Kate heard the soft footstep and turned with a smile. Lady Matilda, I was just...
Lady Matilda...
She never finished the sentence. Because Lady Matilda's face, in that moment, held something Kate had never seen there before. Not anger. Not even cruelty. Something colder than both, or something that had been planned. You cannot have him, Lady Matilda said softly. Laura will. And then she placed both hands on Kate's shoulders and pushed. The balcony railing caught Kate at the waist, and then it did not catch her at all. Silk fell. Trust shattered. The night swallowed her whole, and every single person inside Iron Vale Estate, every lord, every lady, every chandelier and string quartet, heard nothing. Not a scream, not a splash, not a whisper of what had just happened above their heads. But one person saw, and the Duke of Iron Vale, standing in the ballroom below with a glass he had not yet touched, felt something shift in his chest, a cold, inexplicable wrongness, and set the glass down. He would not rest until he understood why. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Because if this story already has your heart in its hands, then you are exactly where you need to be. Thank you so much for being here, and it truly means the world. Now, before we go any further, please hit that subscribe button for us, smash that like, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. It helps this channel grow in ways you cannot imagine, and every single comment, every single click is a hand reaching back to us. We are deeply grateful. All right. Now let us go back, because the story is only just beginning. And Iron Vale Estate sat at the edge of the English countryside like a nobleman who had refused to age. Proud, cold at the edges, beautiful in spite of itself. The main house had 40 rooms, a servants' quarter that ran the length of the east wing, and a tower at its northern corner that was older than any record of it. The tower had no real purpose. It was simply there, the way old things tend to be, holding the memory of 100 years that nobody had bothered to write down. But it was early autumn of 1887 when the engagement was announced. Duke William Charles Grayson was 30 years old, tall, composed, with dark hair and the kind of watchful grey eyes that made people feel he was paying attention even when they wished he were not. He was not a man who smiled easily, but when he did, it changed his face entirely, softening the angles and making him look, just briefly, like someone who had decided the world was worth trusting after all. He had chosen Kate, not because her family name was useful, though it was. Not because his advisors had suggested her, though they had. He had chosen her because of a conversation they had shared on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 18 months before the engagement, when he had watched her stop mid-sentence during a dinner party to gently correct a false story being told about a kitchen maid, by name, with facts, without embarrassment. She had not performed the correction. She had simply offered the truth, or the way a person offers water when someone is thirsty. He had not been able to forget it. The engagement party was Lady Matilda's idea. She had organized every detail: the flowers, the menu, the guest list, the seating, the music. She had moved through the preparations with the precision of a general and the smile of a hostess, and everyone had complimented her on her grace and devotion to her stepdaughter's happiness. Gabriel Thomas, Kate's father, had watched his wife's preparations with quiet pride. He was a gentleman, broad-shouldered and warm-eyed, the kind of man who believed the best of the people around him because he simply could not imagine why anyone would arrange themselves otherwise. He was also, in the way that good-natured men sometimes are, completely blind to what was happening inside his own home. He did not see the way Lady Matilda watched the Duke when she thought no one was looking. He did not see how she always steered Laura into the Duke's eyeline, at the garden parties, at the morning rides, at the afternoon teas. He did not notice that every story Lady Matilda told about Kate to outside guests ended with a flaw, small, seemingly affectionate, but persistent. A story about Kate's clumsiness, Kate's impracticality, Kate's tendency to live in her own world. Kate noticed. She had noticed for years, but she had told herself it was not deliberate, that Lady Matilda simply had a complicated way of showing love, that the world was not as dark as it sometimes felt when she was standing in the same room as her stepmother. She had been wrong. On the evening of the engagement party, Kate came downstairs in her ivory gown, and the room stilled the way rooms do when something genuinely beautiful walks into them. The Duke crossed to her immediately, his hand finding hers, and he looked at her with the kind of steadiness that told her, as without a single word, that he saw her clearly and was glad of it. "You look as though the evening was made for you," he said quietly. "I think you have that reversed," she replied, and the smile he gave her then was the private kind, the one that was not for the room. Lady Matilda, standing 12 feet away with a glass of champagne and a perfectly arranged expression, watched this exchange with eyes that did not match her smile. Laura stood beside her mother. She was a year younger than Kate, with her mother's dark hair and her mother's talent for presentation. She wore a rose-pink gown and kept her posture impeccable, because Lady Matilda had taught her from childhood that posture was the first thing powerful men noticed about a woman. Laura was not cruel by nature, but she had been shaped by a woman who was, and she had learned, slowly and quietly, to mistake her mother's ambitions for her own. The evening unfolded beautifully. Toasts were made, or the Duke danced with Kate twice, which the guests noted and approved of. Gabriel Thomas gave a speech that was warm and a little too long, and made several people smile through genuine emotion. By 10 o'clock, the ballroom was full of the particular contentment that comes when a celebration is going exactly as it should. That was when Lady Matilda touched Kate's arm. "Come with me for a moment, dear. I have something I want to give you, a private engagement gift, and just us. Kate followed her without suspicion, because that was the kind of woman Kate was. She looked for the good in people, even the people who had never quite deserved it from her. She followed Lady Matilda up the stone staircase, through the corridor, and out onto the tower balcony. And then she looked at the stars. She did not hear the balcony door close. She did not know that what was about to happen had been decided months ago, in the privacy of Lady Matilda's dressing room, or in conversations Kate had never been meant to hear. She only knew the stars, and the music below, and the feeling, warm, unhurried, and terribly wrong to lose, that her life was finally beginning. To understand what Lady Matilda did on that balcony, you must first understand what she wanted, and how long she had wanted it. She had married Gabriel Thomas 6 years after the death of his first wife, Kate's mother, a woman named Elizabeth. Though Elizabeth Baker had been the kind of woman that people speak of in hushed, admiring tones long after she is gone. Charitable, clear-eyed, quietly brilliant, deeply loved. The estate staff still said her name with a particular softness. The portrait of her in the East Study still made Gabriel Thomas pause when he walked past it. Lady Matilda had never been able to compete with a ghost. She had tried in her own way in the early years. She had redecorated. She had reorganized the household staff. She had ensured that Elizabeth's portrait was moved from the main hallway to the East Study, where fewer guests would see it. None of it had helped. Gabriel still said Elizabeth's name in his sleep. And Kate, who had her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of finding the precise truth in any situation, was a living reminder that could not be moved to the East Study. The bitterness had grown slowly, or the way bitterness always does, almost imperceptibly at first, hidden beneath the efficient surface of a well-run household. But by the time Kate was 16, Lady Matilda had made a private decision. The estate, the connections, and the social elevation that came with being mother-in-law to a duke would belong to her daughter Laura, not to the child of a woman she could not bury. She had begun the campaign carefully. Yes, she had ensured that Laura received every social advantage, the better tutors, the grander wardrobe, the invitations to the events where eligible men of standing appeared. She had whispered suggestions about Kate into the ears of hostesses. Nothing accusatory. Nothing that could be traced back to her. Just small seeds. Kate is a touch too independent for most men. Kate is lovely, but rather head in the clouds. Kate would be happiest in a quieter life. None of it had worked. Because Duke William Charles Grayson had a habit of observing people before deciding what he thought of them, and what he thought of Kate, after every observation, was that she was exactly who she appeared to be. He found this rare. He valued it enormously. And when the possibility of an engagement arose between their families, he had directed his interest toward Kate with a certainty that surprised everyone. Everyone except Kate herself. But Lady Matilda had spent 2 years watching this happen and arranging her expression into something that looked like happiness. Inside, she had been planning. The tower balcony had not been chosen carelessly. Iron Vale's North Tower was the estate's oldest structure. The stones were uneven, the railing aged iron, the drop on the outside nearly 40 feet to the sloped ground below. An accident there, in the dark, during a party where everyone was occupied and slightly warmed by champagne. It was plausible. It was almost logical. It was the kind of tragedy that people accepted because the alternative, understanding that it was deliberate, or was simply too dark for polite society to look at directly. She had waited for an opportunity when the Duke was occupied, when Gabriel was mid-speech, when the staff were serving. And then she had taken Kate gently by the arm and spoken of a private gift. On the balcony, in the moment before she acted, she said 2 sentences, the only honest sentences she had spoken to Kate in 6 years. "You cannot have him. Laura will. And then she pushed. She was back inside within 90 seconds, for the balcony door closed softly behind her, her champagne glass retrieved from the mantelpiece where she had placed it on the way up. Her heart was beating at a tempo she found inconvenient, but her expression, when she walked back into the ballroom, was the expression of a woman enjoying a lovely evening. Gabriel Thomas did not notice his wife had been absent. Laura glanced at her mother and saw something in her eyes that she had learned, over many years, not to ask about. And downstairs, for in the ballroom, Duke William Charles Grayson set down his untouched glass and looked toward the North Tower with an expression nobody could quite read. Something was wrong. He did not know what. He did not yet know why his stomach had tightened at that particular moment, or why the music suddenly sounded very far away. He moved toward the hallway. He told himself he was simply going to find Kate, that she had probably stepped away for a quiet moment and would return soon, laughing softly at his concern. He was halfway to the staircase when a servant boy named Brennan, 14 years old, sent to collect empty glasses from the east garden path below the tower, came running through the service door with his face entirely drained of colour. The Duke stopped. "Sir," Brennan managed. "Sir, there is a lady, on the ground, sir, below the North Tower." The Duke was already moving. The east garden path ran along the outside of the estate wall, as a narrow gravel walkway, used by groundsmen and servants, lit on ordinary evenings by a single line of iron lanterns. It was not a path that party guests used. It was not a path that appeared in any account of the night that Lady Matilda later gave to the household. Isaac Rhodes had been using it. He was 31 years old, a man of modest but solid respectability, the son of a solicitor from the neighbouring town of Greyfield, who had been invited to the engagement party as part of a small group of local professional men and their families. He was not nobility. He was not wealthy, but he was the kind of man who, having stepped outside for a quiet moment of fresh air, chose the east garden path because he liked the particular way the lanterns reflected in the stone wall, and who had consequently been standing in exactly the right position when a figure in ivory silk came falling from the North Tower. He had not hesitated. He had run. He had reached her. He had found her breathing, barely but breathing, her dark hair across the gravel, one hand still clutching a fold of her gown as though she had tried to hold on to something on the way down. The sloped stone embankment below the tower had broken the full force of the fall, and the soft earth of the garden beyond it had done the rest. It was not a fall anyone should have survived. It was the kind of fall that makes a person believe, as afterward, in things they did not believe in before. Isaac knelt beside her. He checked her breathing. He pressed 2 fingers to her wrist and felt a pulse that was thin and fast, but present. Then he did the bravest and most consequential thing he would do in his entire life. He picked her up, carried her down the path, and did not go through the main estate entrance. He went to his carriage. He told his driver to go immediately to the home of Dr. Lucian, 2 miles east. He did not announce what he had found. He did not raise the alarm. He had seen Lady Matilda step out onto the tower balcony, had seen it through the garden lantern light, the dark gown, the deliberate movement, and had understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that the estate was not a safe place for this woman right now. He would figure out the right thing to do. But first, she had to live. Dr. Lucian's house was warm and cluttered with the particular warmth of a man who has spent 30 years treating the sick and has decorated accordingly, with practicality and without vanity. Lucian himself was 54, grey-haired, precise, and completely unshockable, which was fortunate, because Isaac arrived at his door at 10:45 in the evening, carrying an unconscious woman in an engagement gown with gravel in her hair, and his explanation was not a simple one. Belusian asked 2 questions. First, was she breathing? Second, what did Isaac need him to do? They worked through the night. Kate had fractured her left wrist, cracked 2 ribs, and suffered a deep laceration along her left shoulder. She had a concussion that kept her unconscious until nearly 4 in the morning, but she had not broken her spine. She had not broken her skull. The slope of the embankment had redirected the force of the fall in a way that, Lucian said quietly, that was either very lucky or the intervention of something he did not have a medical term for. At 4 in the morning, Kate opened her eyes. She stared at the unfamiliar ceiling. She turned her head. She saw Isaac Rhodes sitting in a chair by the window, still in his evening clothes, awake. She said nothing for a moment. "Where am I?" "You are safe," Isaac said. "That is the most important thing right now. You are safe, and you are alive. Oh, and Dr. Lucian is in the next room." She looked at his face. She looked at the ceiling again. And then, because she had always been the kind of woman who preferred the truth to comfortable silence, she said, "She pushed me." "Yes," Isaac said. "I saw." Kate closed her eyes again. She did not cry. Not yet. The grief of what had happened was too large and too near to touch. It was the kind of knowledge that your body accepts before your heart does. The slow, a devastating understanding that someone who sat at your breakfast table, someone whose hand you had held as a child, someone you had called family for 11 years, had looked at you and decided you were worth less than her ambition. Outside, the estate lanterns were still burning. Inside, Lady Matilda had constructed a story. She had told the household, and then the guests, and then the arriving constable, that Kate had stepped onto the balcony alone and had leaned too far over the railing in a moment of lightheadedness. Too much champagne, too much excitement, the railing being old and unreliable. A tragic accident. A terrible thing. She had wept, beautifully. Gabriel Thomas had wept beside her, his large hands shaking, his face grey. The constable had looked at the balcony railing. The iron was old, yes. The stone edge was uneven. It was not implausible. And Kate's body, of course, that had not been found, because Kate's body was not in the garden below the tower. Lady Matilda had looked and found nothing, and had concluded, correctly, that the fall had been survived. But she could not say that. So she adjusted. She told them that Kate must have fallen into the river. The estate's narrow decorative canal ran 15 yards from the tower's base. The current would have taken her. It was dark. They would search in the morning. They searched for 3 days. They found nothing. But society declared Kate lost, presumed dead, drowned in the Iron Vale Canal on the night of her own engagement. The mourning notices were prepared. The flowers sent to Gabriel Thomas were numerous and sincere. Kate was eulogized in the way that young women who die before they are properly known are always eulogized, with a great deal of sadness and very little accuracy. Duke William Charles Grayson accepted none of it. He said nothing publicly. He stood at the memorial service in the estate chapel with an expression so carefully composed that nobody could read it. He thanked the guests. He shook hands with the right people. He said the expected things in the expected quiet voice. And then he went back to his study, closed the door, and sat very still in his chair for a long time. He had loved Kate. He had not told her yet, had been saving it for the private moment after the party, a walk in the garden, of the words he had rehearsed 3 times, and then decided not to rehearse because they needed to be real. He had not said the words. He was going to find her. He did not know how yet, but the wrongness he had felt in the ballroom, the cold, precise wrongness at the exact moment it happened, told him something that no constable's report and no search party's failure could override. Kate was not in that canal. Kate was alive, and someone in Iron Vale Estate knew exactly why. Or Kate spent the first 3 weeks of her survival in Dr. Lucian's house, in a small room at the back that looked onto a garden full of lavender and overgrown rosemary. She lay still because she had to. She thought because she could not stop. And slowly, in the way that broken things sometimes do when they are given enough quiet and enough time, she began to understand things she had spent 11 years refusing to see. Lady Matilda had never loved her. This was not a dramatic revelation. It was a quiet one, the quiet of a room where a fire has finally gone out, and you realize, sitting in the cooling air, that it had not been keeping you warm for a very long time. Kate had told herself so many smaller versions of this truth over the years. She had said, when Lady Matilda forgot her birthday, "She is busy." She had said, when Lady Matilda corrected her in public, "She wants me to be better." She had said, when Lady Matilda steered her away from conversations with the Duke, "She is simply protective." She had said all of it because the alternative, accepting that the woman who was supposed to love her simply did not, was something that the younger version of herself had not been equipped to carry. Dr. Lucian, in his quiet and entirely practical way, helped her carry it. He did not offer her false comfort. He did not tell her that Lady Matilda must have had her reasons, or that family was complicated, or that forgiveness was the path to healing. He gave her books. He gave her accurate information about how people become the way Lady Matilda had become, the slow accumulation of resentment, the way jealousy hardens into cruelty when it is never examined, the way a person can construct an entire internal justification for doing something terrible if they are afraid enough of what they stand to lose. He did not excuse Lady Matilda. He explained her. But and there is a great difference. Kate read. She thought. She asked Isaac questions when he visited, which he did every few days, always with a sensible excuse, and always with the particular manner of a man who is doing the right thing and has decided not to make a production of it. She asked him why he had not raised the alarm at the estate that night. "Because I saw the woman on the balcony," he said simply. "And I saw which direction she came from before the event, and which direction she walked after it. I am a solicitor's son, Miss Kate. I know the shape of premeditation when I see it." She was quiet for a moment. "And the Duke?" she asked. "Searching," Isaac said. "Quietly. Officially he is in mourning. Unofficially, he is the most quietly relentless man I have ever observed from a distance." This should have brought her comfort. It did, partially. But it also complicated everything, because going back meant confronting everything Lady Matilda had built in her absence. It meant exposing a woman who was married to her father, who controlled the household, who had already constructed a public narrative that had been accepted by an entire county. It meant understanding that truth, without proof, was just a story, and that Lady Matilda had had 3 weeks to write a better one. Isaac, and reading her expression with the same precision with which he had read the situation in the garden, said, "Not yet. We gather what we need first. Time is not against us here. It is working for us. Let her believe she has won." People who believe they have won grow careless. Kate looked at him. "You have thought about this more than I have." "I have been thinking about little else for 3 weeks, he said, with the slightly embarrassed honesty of a man who has just revealed more than he intended. "You are not alone in this." And that, that simple, unglamorous sentence, was the first time since the fall that Kate did not feel as though the world had become a place designed to undo her. Over the following months, Kate healed. The ribs mended first. 6 weeks, Lucien said, and he was right almost to the day. The wrist took longer. The concussion left her with headaches that arrived without warning and departed without apology. But the deepest thing that healed was not physical. It was the quiet, internal shift that happens when a person stops trying to earn the love of someone who has decided not to give it, and starts, carefully and honestly, learning to value what they actually are. She read everything Lucien's library offered on law, on estate management, on the psychological patterns of emotional manipulation. She read the novels she had always meant to read. She wrote long letters she did not yet send, to her father, to the Duke, letters that she kept in a box beneath the lavender garden window, adding to them as she found the words. She was not waiting to go back and destroy Lady Matilda. She was waiting to go back as herself. Fully. Without apology. And with enough truth in her hands that no one would be able to look away from it. In the meantime, back at Ironvale Estate, Lady Matilda was working very hard to ensure that when anyone did look, they would see only what she wanted them to see. Society, when it decides to move on from grief, moves with extraordinary efficiency. By 3 months after the engagement night, the conversations about Kate had softened from active mourning to fond memory. By 6 months, she was mentioned in the past tense at dinner parties, which is the aristocracy's polite way of closing a chapter. By the end of the first year, Lady Matilda had begun, very carefully, very gradually, to suggest that the Duke of Ironvale ought not to be left in the position of an unmarried man in indefinite mourning. The suggestion was never crude. Nothing Lady Matilda did was crude. It arrived in the shape of sympathy, of concerned observation, of thoughtful commentary made to the right people at the right moments. What a shame it would be, or she said to Rebecca MacLean, Ironvale's most reliable social conduit, for such a fine estate to pass another decade without a proper mistress. Kate would have wanted the Duke to be happy. She knew her stepdaughter. She truly did. The implication was not difficult to follow. Meanwhile, that Duke William Charles Grayson was conducting an investigation that would have impressed a professional inquiry, and was doing so with the patience of a man who had decided that patience was the only tool that would actually work. He had, in the week following Kate's disappearance, engaged a private inquiry agent named Jonathan, a quiet, meticulous man from London who operated at the outer edges of the law's reach and charged accordingly. He had not told Jonathan everything. He had told him enough, that he believed the accident account was false, that the East Garden path was the area of interest, and that he wanted to know if anyone had been seen in that location on the night of the party. Jonathan had found Brennan, the servant boy who had first raised the alarm, and had interviewed him separately from the official household accounts. Brennan, who was 14 and honest in the uncomplicated way that young people sometimes are when they are asked a direct question by someone who clearly already knows part of the answer, told Jonathan that he had seen a carriage leave the estate through the East Service Gate, not the main entrance, at approximately 10:50 on the night of the engagement party. The carriage had belonged to Isaac Rhodes of Greyfield. This was enough. The Duke had gone to Greyfield. He had found Isaac. And Isaac, who had been waiting for the Duke to find him, because he had been fairly certain the Duke eventually would, told him everything. The Duke sat very still through all of it. When Isaac finished speaking, the Duke said, "She is alive. Yes, sir, and she is well. She is healing. She is, if I may say so, considerably stronger than she was before this happened. in ways I think she is only beginning to understand herself. The Duke was quiet for a moment, as something moved across his face that Isaac could not name precisely. Relief and grief and something fierce all at once. "Does she know I have been looking?" "She knows you have been searching. She does not know I have spoken to you." The Duke nodded slowly. "Do not tell her yet. I need to do this correctly. If Lady Matilda suspects that Kate is alive before we are ready to act, she will find a way to control the narrative. She has done it before. I will not let her do it again." Isaac studied him for a moment. "What is your plan?" "Lady Matilda wants me to marry Laura. I am going to let her believe I will. And then, at the moment of maximum public exposure, I am going to make sure she cannot escape what she has done." Isaac was quiet for a beat. "That is either the most intelligent strategy I have ever heard," he said, "or the most controlled act of love." "With any luck," the Duke said, "it is both." Over the following 2 years, the Duke played his role with a composure that would have been frightening if it were not so purposeful. He allowed himself to be gently steered toward Laura at social events. He engaged in the appropriate conversations, accepted the appropriate invitations, attended the appropriate dinners. He was never unkind to Laura. He was never false. He simply remained available, politely, distantly available, in the way that a man who is managing grief can manage without raising suspicion. Internally, though he was building a case, Jonathan continued his work. He gathered witness accounts. He documented the inconsistencies in Lady Matilda's story, the timing, the servant testimonies, the fact that the railing in question, when examined by a structural engineer the Duke hired privately, showed no evidence of failure, but clear evidence of a recent scraping of iron from the outer edge, consistent with someone having been forced over it, not fallen through it. He gathered Lucian's medical records, which the doctor had kept meticulously from the night of the fall. He gathered Isaac's written account, signed and notarized. He gathered the letter that Brennan, now 16, and working in the Duke's own household staff after a quiet reassignment, had written at the Duke's request. A full and detailed account of what he had seen from the east garden path on the night of the engagement party, signed and witnessed. And he waited. Lady Matilda, believing herself victorious, believing that Kate was dead, that the Duke was being successfully guided toward Laura, that her plan was unfolding precisely as she had designed it, was, in those same years, becoming careless in exactly the way Isaac had predicted. She spoke more freely. She arranged more openly. She began to believe that her own intelligence had made her untouchable. She was not paying attention to the quiet. She had never understood that quiet is not the same as absence. Was by the 3rd year, the pressure was no longer subtle. Lady Matilda had reached the conclusion that gentle suggestion was a tool that had served its purpose, and that the next phase required something more direct. She began to speak of a formal arrangement between the Duke and Laura in terms that assumed its inevitability, the way wealthy women sometimes speak of things they have already decided on behalf of other people. She arranged a private dinner. She seated the Duke and Laura beside each other. She ensured that the conversation turned, naturally, toward the subject of the estate, its future, its management, the loneliness of a great house without a family at its center. She was masterful. Any observer would have said the evening was organic. Laura played her part. She had been prepared, encouraged, and coached, though coached was perhaps too blunt a word for the process Lady Matilda used. She had been shaped. Gradually, over years, was into a woman who believed that what her mother wanted and what she herself wanted were the same thing, because questioning that distinction had never been made safe in their household. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Laura. She was not villainous. She was a woman who had never been given a map of her own mind and had therefore been navigating by someone else's the whole of her adult life. She laughed too brightly at the Duke's quiet observations, or she offered opinions she had borrowed from her mother. She was performing, and she knew she was performing, and she did not know how to stop, because stopping meant asking who she actually was. And that question had no comfortable answer. The Duke watched her with careful, neutral courtesy. He was never unkind. He was simply present in the way a man is present when his attention is elsewhere, completely in the room and completely somewhere else at once. Gabriel Thomas, through all of this, was a man being quietly managed by a woman he had trusted for 12 years. He had been told, gently, tearfully, convincingly, that Kate's death had broken Lady Matilda in ways that only work could hold together, and that the work of arranging a proper future for the Duke was her way of honouring Kate's memory. He accepted this. He was a man who accepted things that hurt too much to examine. He was also, by the 3rd year, unwell. A chest complaint, nothing severe, the physician said, but persistent. That had made him slower, quieter, less present at meals. Lady Matilda managed his care with the same precision she managed everything else, which meant she managed the information that reached him about the world outside his bedroom windows. He did not know his wife was orchestrating a wedding. He did not know that the Duke had privately agreed to it. He did not know that his daughter was alive. The announcement came in February of the 3rd year. Duke William Charles Grayson of Ironvale would wed Miss Laura in a ceremony to be held at St. Aldrich's Cathedral in the 3rd week of April. The invitations were sent. The guest list, curated by Lady Matilda, was extensive. The announcement in the county papers used words like closure and hopeful future and new chapter. Lady Matilda was quoted expressing her deep joy at seeing the Duke find peace after his long period of grief. Rebecca MacLean, who read the announcement over her morning tea, thought it was all rather rushed, but said nothing to anyone except her husband Jonathan, who was not the same Jonathan employed by the Duke, and who agreed with his wife that it did seem rather rushed, and then both of them went on with their mourning. Kate read the announcement in a different way entirely. Isaac had sent it to her, quietly, sealed, along with a note that said only, "It is time." She sat with it at the lavender garden window for a long time. 3 years of healing, of education, of gathering herself back into a shape that was stronger than the one that had fallen off the tower. And now the moment had arrived that all of that had been building toward. She was afraid. She would not have been human if she were not. Going back meant facing the woman who had tried to kill her. It meant standing in a room full of people who had spent 3 years believing she was dead. And it meant confronting her father, who would need to understand things that would break his heart. It also meant seeing William again. She had not let herself think about him often, because thinking about him made the whole 3 years feel like a physical distance she had no idea how to cross. He had chosen her before. She could not know, had no way of knowing, what 3 years of absence and grief and social pressure had done to the shape of what he felt. She folded the announcement carefully and placed it in the box with her unsent letters. Then she wrote a new letter, not to her father, not to the Duke, but to Isaac. It said, "I am ready. Tell me the plan." The Duke had told no one, except Isaac and Jonathan, what he knew and what he intended to do. This required a discipline that most people would have found impossible, attending dinners in the same house as Lady Matilda, sitting across from her at formal occasions, or watching her steer conversations and manage narratives, and smile at him with the precise confidence of a woman who believed she had already won, and doing nothing that would betray what he knew. He was very good at it. The control that some people read as coldness in him was, in these 3 years, his greatest asset. Lady Matilda, who was perceptive about most things, read his composure as the composure of a man who had accepted what could not be changed. She was not wrong about the composure. She was wrong about what was underneath it. The formal agreement to marry Laura had cost him more than he showed. Not because of Laura. He bore no particular feeling toward her, positive or negative. She was a woman in an impossible situation that she hadn't chosen with full clarity, and he could not hold against her what had been constructed around her. But accepting the engagement publicly meant accepting a version of events that required him to proceed as though Kate no longer existed. And there was something in him that resisted this with a ferocity that the composed exterior barely contained. He had visited Dr. Lucian once, alone, 6 months before the wedding announcement. He had not told Kate he was coming. He had sat in the same cluttered consulting room with the lavender through the window, and Lucian had made him tea, and they had spoken about nothing in particular for 15 minutes, and then the Duke had asked the question he had actually come to ask. Is she well? Truly well? Lucian had looked at him for a moment, with the particular expression of a man who has been trusted with something large. She is more than well, Your Grace. She is one of the most remarkably self-possessed young women I have met in 30 years of practice. What happened to her did not diminish her. It clarified her. The Duke had sat with that for a moment. And does she... He stopped, started again. Does she speak of coming back? She speaks of doing it correctly, Lucian said. Which, if I understand her correctly, means not until the ground is prepared and the truth is ready to be seen. The Duke had nodded. He had finished his tea. He had thanked Lucian with the particular brevity of a man who is holding more feeling than he intends to display in a consulting room, and he had driven home through an October countryside that he barely saw. Now, in the weeks approaching the wedding, the preparation moved into its final stage. Jonathan arrived at the Duke's private study on a Monday evening with a leather satchel that contained every piece of documented evidence they had gathered over 3 years, the written testimonies, the medical records, the structural engineer's assessment of the balcony railing, Brennan's account, Isaac's notarized statement, to 2 additional witness accounts from estate staff who, when interviewed privately 3 years after the event, had recalled details that contradicted Lady Matilda's version of the evening. The Duke reviewed everything. It is sufficient, Jonathan said. More than sufficient. A magistrate would act on half of this. I do not want a magistrate to act on it in a private office, the Duke said. I want it known, publicly and irrevocably. I want there to be no version of events available to her that is not buried under this. Jonathan understood. The plan for the wedding day was precise. The evidence satchel would be held by Jonathan in the cathedral's vestibule. Magistrate Henry, a man of the Duke's acquaintance, a solid and respected official, had been briefed and had agreed to be present as a guest, positioned to act immediately upon public disclosure, where Isaac would bring Kate to the cathedral and remain with her until the moment. The Duke would proceed with the ceremony until the last possible moment, because the last possible moment, in a cathedral full of the county's aristocracy, was the most public moment available. And Lady Matilda needed to be brought to account in the most public way possible, not because the Duke was vindictive, but because Lady Matilda had built her safety on public narrative, and it was only in public that her safety could be completely and finally removed. There was one more thing to arrange. The Duke wrote a letter. He gave it to Isaac to deliver. It was addressed to Kate. It was not long. It said, "I have been looking since the night you fell. I did not find you soon enough, and I am sorry for every day of the time that cost you. What I ask of you now, coming back into that room, in front of all of them, I know the cost of that for you. I ask it not because I need it. I ask it because you deserve to stand in the truth of what happened in front of the people who were deceived and to see it corrected with your own eyes. You do not have to come, but if you do, I will be there. I have always been there. W.W." Kate read the letter 4 times. Then she folded it very carefully and placed it in the box with the others. Then she went to tell Isaac she was ready, for the morning of the wedding arrived with the particular brightness that April sometimes offers as a kind of irony. Clean blue sky, pale gold sunlight, a freshness in the air that made everything feel like a beginning. St. Aldrich's Cathedral had been dressed for the occasion. White roses filled every alcove. The pews held 300 guests, lords, ladies, magistrates, physicians, landowners, and the county's most energetically social members of the professional classes. If the organ played at a respectful volume, the candles on the altar burned with complete indifference to what was about to happen around them. Lady Matilda sat in the front pew in a deep burgundy gown, her back straight, her expression, the expression of a woman who has spent 3 years working toward a single moment and has arrived at it without breathing too visibly. She looked triumphant. She had the discipline to keep that triumph contained to a quiet internal satisfaction that showed only in the particular set of her shoulders and the barely perceptible lift of her chin. Gabriel Thomas sat beside her, pale but present, helped in by his cane that morning. He had been told the Duke had agreed to the wedding and had accepted it with the quiet resignation of a man who had learned, in 3 years of grief and illness, or that he did not always understand the things that happened around him. He was thinking of Kate. He was thinking of Elizabeth. He was thinking that his hands felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with the cane. Laura was in the cathedral vestibule. She wore a cream gown, carefully chosen by her mother to recall, without explicitly copying, the gown that Kate had worn on the night of the engagement. Laura's hands were not quite steady. She had told herself, over 3 years, that this was what she wanted. She had told herself so many times that the sentence had worn smooth and featureless, like a stone polished by water. She was not sure any more what she felt. She was not sure she had ever been. The Duke stood at the altar. He was as composed as he always was. His grey eyes were steady. His hands did not move. He looked to every person in that cathedral like a man who had made his peace with the path life had set before him. He was watching the back doors. But in the vestibule, Laura had been positioned to walk. The priest was ready. Jonathan stood in the shadows to the right, his satchel in hand, his expression that of a man who is counting seconds. Magistrate Henry occupied a pew on the right-hand side, close to the aisle, beside 2 constables who were present in their Sunday clothes and carrying more authority than their attire suggested. At precisely 11:30, the moment the organ shifted into the processional, the cathedral's rear door opened. Not for Laura, Isaac Rhodes walked in first. He walked to the end of the centre aisle and stood. 300 people looked at him. Lady Matilda's chin dropped a fraction of an inch, and then Kate walked through the door. She was in deep blue, a gown of quiet authority, not ivory, not white, not anything that could be read as bridal imitation. Her dark hair was pinned simply, what with one small ivory flower behind her left ear, the only softness in an otherwise deliberate appearance. She walked without hesitation. Her left hand, which still sometimes ached in cold weather from the fracture that had healed 3 years ago, was steady at her side. The sound that went through the cathedral was not a gasp. It was the sound of 300 people simultaneously losing the ability to produce any sound at all. A suspended, a collective silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and felt considerably longer. Gabriel Thomas made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a man makes when something he has grieved for 3 years walks through a door. The sound of the body registering joy before the mind has caught up with it. His cane slipped. He did not fall. Lady Matilda's hand shot out and caught his arm. And then, realizing what she had done, she released it, and her face went a color that no gown could have been made to match. Kate walked the length of the center aisle. She looked at no one except the Duke. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 3 years in the private place where he had kept her, completely and without apology. She stopped in the center of the cathedral, between the pews, where everyone could see her. "My name is Kate," she said, and her voice was clear and even, carrying to the back of the cathedral without effort. "I am Gabriel Thomas's daughter. 3 years ago, on the night of my engagement to Duke William Charles Grayson of Iron Vale, I was pushed from the North Tower balcony of this estate. I did not fall. I was pushed. I survived. And I am here, now, to ensure that what happened is known." The silence held. Then Lady Matilda stood. "This is an impostor," she began. Isaac spoke from the rear of the aisle. "Or Dr. Lucian will attest to her identity, her injuries, and the medical record of her care beginning the night of her fall." Jonathan stepped forward. "This satchel contains sworn testimonies from 4 witnesses, including a structural assessment of the balcony railing, confirming the manner of her departure from it, and a notarized account of what Mr. Isaac Rhodes observed from the east garden path at approximately 10:40 on the night in question." Magistrate Henry rose from his pew. Lady Matilda turned very slowly. Her face was entirely composed. She had been caught and she knew it, and she was deploying, in that last possible moment, every ounce of social training she possessed. The straight back, the level chin, the steady gaze. It was, in its way, magnificent. It was also completely useless. Gabriel Thomas had not moved. He was looking at Kate. He had not stopped looking at Kate from the moment she walked through the door. His face was doing something difficult. Grief and joy and the slow, terrible understanding of what he had not seen for 12 years, all working through him at once. "Kate," he said softly. She crossed to him. She knelt down. She took both his hands in hers and held them. "I am here, Father. I am all right." He held her hands for a long moment, and then he looked up, past her, at Lady Matilda, who was still standing, straight-backed and expressionless. Then as 2 constables moved toward her, with the quiet efficiency of men performing a task they have been briefed on. He said nothing to his wife. He did not need to. Laura had not moved from the vestibule doorway. She had watched the whole of it from there, her mother's collapse in slow motion, the evidence arriving like a tide, Kate standing in the center of the cathedral where she herself had been about to stand. And then something happened in Laura's face that nobody present would have expected. She sat down on the vestibule steps, and she covered her face with both hands. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, perhaps for the first time ever, she cried not for her mother's plan or her own position or the public exposure, but simply because she was utterly exhausted from carrying the weight of something that had never, in truth, been hers to carry. It was the most honest thing she had done in years. The Duke had not moved from the altar. He watched Kate stand up, watched her face turn toward him across the length of the cathedral, watched her see him properly for the first time in 3 years. He stepped down from the altar. He walked the center aisle toward her. He stopped 2 feet from her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on the engagement evening, completely, privately, as though the 300 people around them were a very pleasant background feature, and nothing more. "You're taller than I remembered," he said quietly. "I am wearing different shoes," she said. And then, for the first time in 3 years, Kate smiled. It changed the room the way her smile had always changed rooms. Quickly and without effort, the way sunlight changes a room when a curtain is finally pulled back. The Duke's face did what it did only rarely. He smiled back. "Let us speak of consequences. Because every story that is worth the weight of its own telling must account for what happens after the truth arrives, not in a tidy, comfortable paragraph, but with the real texture of justice, which is never quite as clean as we wish it to be." Lady Matilda was taken by the constables that afternoon. She walked with them with her spine perfectly straight and her expression perfectly controlled, because Lady Matilda had never learned to do anything except perform composure, and she performed it now as an act of pure instinct, even as the walls of the life she had constructed collapsed around her. She said nothing. She asked for her solicitor. She was processed with the appropriate legal formality. The charges that followed were serious: attempted murder, fraudulent misrepresentation to the county constabulary, obstruction of a formal investigation, and the evidence gathered by Jonathan over 3 years was thorough to a degree that left her legal representative with very limited ground to stand on. The structural assessment of the balcony railing was particularly damning. It was the kind of objective, technical evidence that cannot be argued around, only accepted. The trial took place in autumn of that year. Lady Matilda maintained her composure through it. She sat in the dock in appropriately sober attire and answered questions with the precision of a woman who had been managed information all her life and was now managing it in the only direction still available to her, upward, toward whatever reduced sentence might be achieved through cooperation and controlled presentation. She did not break down. She did not confess with any evident remorse. She offered, through her solicitor, was a version of events that attributed the push to a moment of temporary madness, a phrase that infuriated Kate when she read it in the account the following day, and that the presiding judge addressed with the flat, unimpressed clarity of a man who has seen this particular argument deployed before, and found it unconvincing. Lady Matilda was sentenced to 12 years' imprisonment. The county papers reported it. Rebecca McLean read the report over her morning tea and said to her husband, but in the dry tone she reserved for situations that were beyond ordinary commentary. Well, there it is then. Laura did not attend the trial. She had written a letter to the court confirming specific elements of her mother's behavior over the years. Written it, Kate was told afterward, with the careful honesty of a woman who has finally decided that truth is preferable to comfort, even when it is expensive. The letter was taken into account. Laura's cooperation, and the court's assessment of her position as a person shaped by manipulation rather than driven by independent malice, meant that she faced no criminal charge. She left the county in the weeks after the trial. Where she went, Kate did not know. She hoped, genuinely, that wherever Laura landed, it was somewhere her mother's voice couldn't follow. Gabriel Thomas was the most complicated consequence of all. He had spent 12 years married to a woman he didn't know, but this was not something he could resolve in a conversation, or a week, or even a season. The illness that had made him slow and quiet over the preceding year turned out to be less medical than it seemed. In the weeks after the trial, with the household reorganized and the true shape of his life brought into focus, he improved steadily. What had looked like a chest complaint appeared to have been, in no small part, of the physical expression of a man who had been carrying a grief he did not understand, and a home he had not quite been allowed to see clearly. He and Kate sat together every morning for the first month after the trial. They talked about Elizabeth. They talked about the years Kate had grown up with a woman who did not love her in a house that should have been safe. They talked about the things Gabriel had missed and the things he wished he had seen, and the weight of the word should, in retrospect, which is perhaps the heaviest word there is. Kate did not blame him. This was not performance or politeness. She had spent 3 years understanding how manipulation works, how it operates through the people who are closest to it, how it uses love as a lens to distort what a person sees, how a good man can miss a great deal when a clever woman has decided what he is allowed to observe. She had understood all of this at Dr. Lucian's house, among the lavender and the honest books. She had understood it because she had needed to be free of it herself. She gave her father the truth without weaponizing it, and he received it the way honest grief is received, painfully, and with the particular gratitude of someone who is finally being trusted with what is real. Isaac Rhodes, for his part, was rewarded in the way that truly good people prefer to be rewarded, not with ceremony, but with acknowledgement. Or the Duke arranged for his family's legal practice to become the official solicitor to the Iron Vale estate, a connection that would have taken the Rhodes family another generation to achieve through ordinary means. Isaac himself received a private letter from Kate that he kept and never showed anyone, and which, if you could read it, you would find contained more genuine gratitude than most people receive in a lifetime. Brennan, who was 17 now and had grown several inches since the engagement party, was offered a permanent position in the estate household with full references and the kind of future that honest observation in the right moment can sometimes purchase. Dr. Lucian received nothing except the Duke's sincere thanks and Kate's promise to ensure that his name was spoken well wherever she had occasion to speak it. He said this was entirely sufficient, and went back to his lavender garden with the air of a man who has done a good thing and does not require additional comment on the matter. 1 week after the trial ended, on a Friday morning in early November when the English countryside had gone gold and rust, and the particular quiet that arrives when summer has finally accepted its conclusion, Kate and William Charles Grayson were married. There were no 300 guests. There was no cathedral, or there was no organ processional, and no county paper announcement, and no carefully curated guest list. There was the estate chapel, small, stone-walled, lit by candles and a single stained glass window that threw coloured light across the floor in the morning. There was the priest. There was Gabriel Thomas, sitting in the front pew with his cane resting against the stone beside him, and his eyes already bright before anything had begun. There was Isaac Rhodes and Dr. Lucian and Brennan, though slightly overdressed for the occasion, and clearly having made a considerable effort. There was Rebecca MacLean, who had, for reasons nobody had entirely explained to her, found herself invited, and who attended with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had suspected for some time that the official narrative had been wrong. And there was Kate. She wore deep ivory, not the engagement gown, which had not survived the fall in any form worth recovering, but a new one. Simple, fitted, but with long sleeves that covered the scar on her left shoulder, and that she was entirely at peace with, because the scar was hers, part of the story she had survived and chosen, and was not interested in hiding. The Duke had not seen her yet when she entered the chapel. He was standing at the altar with his back to the door, looking at the coloured light from the window, and she could see, from the slight tension in his shoulders, which were doing the thing they did when he was holding more feeling than he intended to, that he was nervous in the particular way that composed people get nervous when the moment they have been working toward for 3 years is about to actually arrive. She walked to the front of the chapel. He turned. They looked at each other for a moment without speaking, the same way they had looked at each other in the cathedral, but without the 300 people, without the drama, but without the necessity of saying anything for an audience. Just the two of them in a small stone room with colored light on the floor. "You came," he said. "I always intended to," she said. "I simply needed to be ready." He took her hand. The priest spoke. The words were the old words. Simple, direct, the kind that have survived centuries because they are honest enough to need no ornamentation. The candles burned, but Gabriel Thomas held his handkerchief in both hands and made no attempt to pretend he was not using it. Brennan in the back pew was also making no such attempt, and would deny this for the rest of his life. When the ceremony was done and the register signed, the Duke leaned toward Kate, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something solemn, something appropriate to the weight of the 3 years and the morning and the colored light. "We were supposed to have a breakfast reception," he said instead. "I arranged it for 8 people, and I have somehow ended up with 12. Brennan appears to have invited himself to the kitchen." Kate laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere genuine, uncalculated, bright, slightly surprised by itself. The chapel was small enough that it filled the space completely, and Gabriel Thomas, hearing it, put his handkerchief away and smiled for the first time in 3 years in a way that reached all the way up. The breakfast was excellent. The fire in the estate dining room was generous. Outside, the November garden was frosted at the edges and entirely beautiful. And nobody inside thought very much about anything except the warmth of the room and the food and the particular quality of the morning. Kate sat beside her husband, which was a word she tried quietly and found that it fit, and allowed herself to feel, fully and without reservation, the thing that 3 years of survival and preparation had been building toward. The ordinary, extraordinary permission to be happy. She was safe. She was known. She was home. She was loved, not the love that requires you to be smaller than you are, or quieter than you are, or to smooth your edges until you fit the shape that someone else has decided you should occupy, but the love that sees you clearly and is glad of what it sees, the love that finds your strength convenient rather than threatening, and your truth valuable rather than uncomfortable, the love that, once offered, does not require daily maintenance through fear. Or the lesson of this, if you are looking for it, is not simply about villainy and justice. It is about recognition. The ability to recognize, in the people around you, the difference between love that builds you and pressure that diminishes you. Lady Matilda had never built anyone. She had shaped people to fit spaces she required, and then discarded them when the space changed. Her daughter had been her greatest victim, shaped, directed, and never given the kindness of her own reflection. Love, or the real kind, does not behave like that. And you are always allowed, always at any age, in any position, to notice the difference. The months that followed were the kinds of months that deserve to be written about, not because they were dramatic, but because they were genuinely good. And genuinely good months are underwritten in most accounts, as though happiness is less interesting than its absence. But it is not. The contentment of a life where you are safe and known and free to be entirely yourself is one of the rarest and most valuable things that exists in the world, and Kate and the Duke inhabited it with the particular gratitude of two people who understood exactly what it had cost. They walked the estate grounds every morning. The Duke discovered that Kate had strong opinions about the South Garden's border plantings and was entirely correct about them. Kate discovered that the Duke had a dry, precise sense of humor that he deployed rarely and always at the exact right moment. They argued, twice, about nothing particularly important, and one of those times Kate was right, and the other time the Duke was right, and both of them knew which was which is perhaps the sign of a good marriage. Gabriel Thomas moved into the estate guest quarters in January. His health continued to improve. He took his tea every afternoon in the conservatory and read the papers and spoke with Kate every morning, and slowly, the way wounds heal when the thing that caused them has been removed, the grey weight that had settled on him over 3 years began to lift. Spring came with particular emphasis that year, the kind of spring that arrives as though making a point, all warmth and blossom and the assertive green of things insisting on growing. The South Garden looked exactly as Kate had said it would, if they planted what she had recommended. In late July, Kate told the Duke something in the morning, before breakfast, in the private language of two people who have been paying close attention to each other. He was very still for a moment. Then he took both her hands in his. "Are you certain?" "Dr. Lucian is certain," she said. "Oh, I am simply delighted." He lifted her hands and pressed them to his face and said nothing for a long moment. "A Grayson," he said finally, with the slightly stunned quality of a man encountering information too large to process quickly. "There is going to be a Grayson." "There is going to be a person," Kate corrected him, with the particular precision she had always had and that he had always loved. "We will find out which kind." He looked at her. He smiled, the private smile, the rare one. "You are still always right," he said. "Almost always," she replied. "I am working on humility." The baby arrived in the last week of April, 10 months after the wedding, on a morning with the same unreasonable brightness that April had offered at St. Aldrich's Cathedral the year before, but which felt, this time, entirely sincere. She was small and certain of her own opinions, and had dark hair that went in several directions simultaneously, and eyes that were going to settle into grey. The doctor said, or possibly something else. It was early to say. Gabriel Thomas held her in the conservatory while Kate slept, and the Duke sat in the chair beside the window and looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who has just discovered that love has more forms than he previously understood. They named her Elizabeth, after Kate's mother, after a woman who had been loved and remembered, and who had, in her own way, through the daughter she had given the world, outlasted everything that had tried to obscure her. Gabriel Thomas looked at the name written in the register and did not try to explain what he felt. He did not need to. Outside, the estate grounds were in full bloom. The South Garden border was exactly right. The tower stood at the estate's northern corner, as it always had, older than any record of it, holding 100 years that nobody had bothered to write down. It looked different now. Not less of what it was, but surrounded by so much life and warmth and ordinary, extraordinary goodness that the memory it held had been given its proper proportion. A terrible thing that had happened, that had been survived, that had been answered with truth rather than silence, and that had led, by the particular and stubborn insistence of two people who refused to let it be the final word, to this. A small girl with dark hair, a name that meant something, a morning that nobody needed to hold still, because it was already staying. Before we close, if this story moved you, if it stirred something real, then you already know what this space is about. We do not just tell stories here. We tell the kind of stories that stay with you, that make you think, that remind you of your own strength and the importance of truth. If you believe in what we do, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button and leave us a comment. Tell us your favorite moment. Tell us what this story made you feel. Tell us where you are watching from. Every single one of those actions is an act of support that helps us keep bringing you stories like this one. We are so grateful for every one of you. Thank you, deeply. This story was built around a truth that does not belong only to Victorian England. It belongs to every age. Emotional manipulation is not always loud. It does not always announce itself. It often arrives in the form of someone who organizes your flowers, manages your household, and smiles at all the right moments, while quietly, systematically dismantling your sense of what you are worth and what you deserve to have. Lady Matilda's story is the story of what happens when ambition is left completely unexamined, when resentment is never brought into the light, when a person decides that the inconvenience of another human being justifies treating them as something less than a person. She was not a monster from the beginning. She became one, increment by increment, in the darkness of her own unaddressed fears. Kate's story is the story of survival, not in the dramatic sense, but in the daily, unglamorous sense, the slow work of understanding what happened to you, finding accurate language for it, and deciding that it will define neither your past nor your future. Her greatest act of courage was not walking through the cathedral door. It was spending 3 years becoming the person who was ready to walk through it. There is a great deal written about resilience, but very little of it captures what resilience actually looks like in a real person, which is not dramatic heroism, but quiet, stubborn, so daily insistence on understanding the truth and choosing to grow toward it rather than away from it. Kate chose growth. If this story has given you anything, one thought, one moment of recognition, one breath of the particular relief that comes from seeing injustice answered, then it has done what it came to do. Thank you for staying to the end. It means more than you know. We will see you in the next tale.